Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2. Today I'm going to be showing you guys a pretty much perfected version of the Minion Necromancer build, which is just unbelievably powerful. It's definitely one of the strongest builds in the entire game right now, considering the fact that you can do literally over 1 billion damage with a very particular version of the build to Uber Lilith, but even without a particular Uber Lilith version of the build, you're doing hundreds of millions of damage a second in Nightmare Dungeons, and not only that, you are pretty much immune, literally can't take any damage all the time because you're just constantly in Blood Mist, and you're just watching your minions literally kill everything for you. You can also clear dungeons incredibly quickly and even in a tier 100 setting because the damage output is just so unbelievably high, and because you just get a ridiculous amount of cooldown reduction and all this other stuff that functions just amazingly with the build. Out of all of the builds that I've used, this is probably one of the overall strongest in the game because you really almost need no gear to set it up. People have done Uber Lilith with almost no gear equipped. It's just unbelievably insane. You just do ridiculous amounts of damage just all the time, and being literally immune to damage almost all the time makes it by far one of the most relaxed builds to play. You can kind of just walk around and everything just dies around you. It's pretty insane. Before I get into the build, I want to give a big thanks to today's sponsor, Diablo.trade, which is a brand new website that came out a couple weeks ago. You can just hop on here and not only buy items for pretty good amounts of gold, so you can just literally find the perfect item that you're looking for. For example, this two-handed sword is actually pretty insane if you're playing Bonespear Necromancer, but you could also sell your own items and make a ton of gold, which I'll show you guys the process of doing. But if you're looking for some items, you can even get consumables too, which are really nice if you're trying to do tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons. The Iron Skin Elixirs is amazing for the armor there, but also if you're just trying to find something very particular, a pair of boots for your sorcerer or something. As you can see, there's a pretty nice pair of Frost Nova teleport boots that I could get here for very, very cheap. But also if I want to make a ton of gold, I could just take a screenshot of an item, post it in here, and as you can see, it is going to auto-populate with all of the stats here, and then I can just say, okay, this is probably worth about 5 million gold or so. Pretty nice pair of boots, and then I could just post them up, and it would show here in my listings. As you can see, I was able to sell this crossbow that I previously listed, and all you have to do is just link your battle, and then your items will show up in this massive list of other items here. It's a fantastic way to not only make gold, but also literally perfect your build. They're also doing a Steam Deck giveaway, so make sure to check out the link in the description, and a huge thanks to them for sponsoring today's video. Alright, let's just jump into it real quick. I want to give a huge thanks to Play-Doh Bear for letting me use the footage of his character. He has a pretty much near perfected version of the Minion Necromancer build. Some of his rolls are a little bit unfortunate, but big thanks to him. If you guys have any questions, feel free to check him out over on Twitch. He does a ton of free Uber Lilith carries, etc. Link of his will be in the description. And also a big thanks to Synody, who did a ton of the theory crafting and testing for this build previously, and putting in a lot of work so that I don't have to. So big thanks to both of them. But anyways, jumping into the build, this build is very particular in how you set it up and what each of the skills do, so it's very important to understand exactly how it works, but it actually is pretty simple. I'll make sure to go over everything. There isn't a ton of variance in how you can set it up. There's pretty much just a best version of it, and that's kind of what we're using. And again, everything works very particularly together, so I'll do my best to explain all that so you guys can fully understand exactly how the build works. The crux of the build is taking advantage of the Ring of Mendeln. Unfortunately, without this, the build isn't really going to function. You can definitely do minion builds without the ring, but you scale those builds entirely differently because the Ring of Mendeln doesn't actually count as minion damage, it counts as your damage. And also, it being lucky hit means that we need to take advantage of a ton of lucky hit mechanics. For example, Bone Prison, which is actually currently bugged, which a guarantee gives us a lucky hit as a result of using the vulnerable modifier here, which is also nice because it applies vulnerable, right? But as a result of this, we basically guarantee get the lucky hit effect, which is going to empower all of our minions, making them deal physical damage whenever they do their next attack. We're also getting a ridiculous amount of lucky hits just by default by using Corpse Explosion, which is constantly auto-proccing as a result of our Sacrilegious Malignant Heart, where anytime we just run near enemies, we're constantly just proccing the Corpse skill. But we also have Bone Storm up permanently as well, which has a pretty high lucky hit too. Even if the Bone Prison bug were to get fixed, the build still has ridiculous potential because you just put on Bone Spear instead, which has a 50% lucky hit chance, and we have all this other lucky hit stuff. So losing that really actually doesn't matter. It is just nice for the guarantee though, that anytime you press it, you're going to then empower your minions, and then they're just going to pop off. Then our goal is to basically just scale the damage of the Mendeln, which actually, like I said, counts as our damage and not minion damage. So scaling minion damage doesn't do anything for the build. Our goal is basically just to keep the minions alive and then scale our own damage in the form of crit and just straight up damage as much as humanly possible. We can scale up our damage very high by taking advantage of Shadow Blight, which also happens to just deal some damage on its own, which is particularly nice so we don't have to fully rely on Mendeln, but getting the Shadow Blight damage is good, and we can proc Shadow Blight constantly by taking advantage of Bone Storm becomes a darkness skill, while also proccing Corpse Explosion, counting as a darkness skill through Blighted Corpse Explosion, and we're constantly proccing those with Blood Mist. We also are able to have Blood Mist up permanently because we are using the Decrepify Heart here, which is constantly going to have Decrepify around our character. Therefore, we are getting a ridiculous amount of cooldown reduction with Abhorrent Decrepify. This is why we're able to stay on our Blood Mist literally 24/7 and have Bone Storm up 24/7, which is not only proccing all of the darkness skills, doing the darkness damage to therefore proc Shadow Blight, but it's also giving us more lucky hits for Mendeln, and it also is giving us permanent damage reduction as well as permanent crit chance. So everything just works very synergistically together to give you this unbelievably broken combo of being able to just Blood Mist permanently, which puts corpses on the ground. Spawning these corpses gives us more cooldown reduction with our Blood Mist, so we can Blood Mist more often, which then spawning these corpses is going to do more of the Blighted Corpse Explosion, which gives us more Disobedient stacks, does more shadow damage on the ground. Proccing the Shadow Blight, we get more lucky hits for our Mendeln, and also because we're forming all these corpses, we have permanent Fortify with Necrotic Carapace. Sorry that I'm going over a lot. It's kind of just a little convoluted how the build works, but that is the crux of it, is that basically you're trying to just do as much damage as humanly possible with the Ring of Mendeln, and then you constantly have all of your corpse skills auto-proccing, and also you get the Corpse Tendrils for the guaranteed vulnerable application, so you can take advantage of all that extra damage. Everything gets sucked in, you do a whole bunch of damage to one guy with Barber, everything gets blown up, you gain all the crit chance, the crit damage, and all these extra damage modifiers to enemies after you get all the Shadow Blight and after you Corpse Tendril them. As a result of using the Sacrilegious Malignant Heart as well, we also don't ever have to actually manually spawn our skeletons. They will just constantly be reprocking because the game will actually prioritize spawning new skeletons over using Corpse Tendrils or Corpse Explosion, so we're always just going to have our minions up, and we're also scaling a lot of minion HP so that they don't die constantly. For those of you that didn't care about the very convoluted explanation of the build, basically we're using Blood Mist for a permanent immunity. Also, it is going to leave corpses behind, which pairs very nicely with Corpse Explosion, constantly doing shadow damage on the ground, which procs our lucky hits for our Ring of Mendeln. We have Bone Prison for a guaranteed lucky hit, as well as the vulnerable application, but that's not that great. We're mainly using it for the guaranteed lucky hit so that our minions become empowered. Corpse Tendrils is amazing for the vulnerable application, pulls everything in and stuns it, and we also deal extra damage to enemies when they are Corpse Tendrilled, and we get a permanent extra crit chance. And then we have Bone Storm up literally permanently for 15% damage reduction and 20% crit chance, but it also has very high lucky hit, and it counts as a darkness skill, so we permanently have our Shadow Blight damage multiplier active. And we also have points spent into Decrepify for the cooldown reduction, because we permanently have a Decrepify around our character, and this cooldown reduction with all of our other lucky hit stuff is basically going to make it to where we have permanent uptime on Blood Mist, Bone Storm, and we also just are able to spam our Corpse Tendrils manually as well as automatically with the Sacrilegious Heart. When it comes to skill tree, there's a couple different ways to set it up, but honestly there's not really all that much variance, and this is what I'd recommend for 99% of people. Putting points into Bone Splinters and Bloodlance, you just have to do that in order to progress the tree. And then we go 3 points into Hued Flesh for the guaranteed corpse spawning. Not guaranteed, but for the chance to just spawn more corpses. More corpses just means more cooldown reduction for our Blood Mist, because anytime we go over a corpse with our Blood Mist with one of our legendaries, we reduce the cooldown of it. And also, the more corpses the better. Generally, we don't really have anywhere else to put those points. Then we go into Blood Mist for the, I mean, this doesn't really matter, the overpower, but then the corpse on the ground all the time. And the corpses that we're getting is going to be consumed with one of our legendaries, constantly proccing Corpse Explosion so that we always have these darkness pools on the ground, which procs our Shadow Blight as well as gives us a ton of armor through Disobedience. Then we put 3 points into Skeletal Warrior Mastery just so they have more HP. And then we have some points into Bone Prison here. This is literally just for cooldown reduction on Bone Prison, just so you can spam it more often, which gives us a guaranteed lucky hit chance in the form of enemies inside of Bone Prison are vulnerable. If you do not have this modifier, it will not make the enemies guaranteed, or it will not give you the guaranteed lucky hit. But if this were to get patched and the bug were to be fixed, you would simply just take Bone Prison off and replace it with a Bone Spear, and you'd probably just play like Paranormal Bone Spear for additional bone shards for a higher lucky hit chance, and you just sit there and spam that. But you have very high lucky hit as it is with your Bone Storm as well as your Corpse Explosion. Then we have Grim Harvest and Fueled by Death, literally just for additional damage. Not hugely impactful, just extra damage all the time. And again, Ring of Mendeln counts as our damage and not our minion damage, so scaling up our personal damage will increase the damage of Ring of Mendeln. Then we have 3 points into Death's Embrace for close range damage reduction and also just additional damage. You could argue for putting points into Death's Reach, but it is not active all the time. And it does seem that close range damage, your Ring of Mendeln minions do benefit from that as long as you are standing, as you yourself is standing close to enemies. 3 and 2 amplify damage, and then we get this on the amulet as well because we're constantly having Decrepify around our character at all time, which applies slow by default, makes enemies deal less damage. So we're getting damage value out of the guaranteed crowd control here, but also because it counts as a curse skill, we're getting a crazy amount of damage through amp damage. 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery so our mages stay alive. Then we go into Corpse Tendrils for the guaranteed vulnerable application, which is very, very good for us, so we have a way to apply vulnerable, and we're constantly Corpse Tendriling pretty much everything with our Malignant Heart. Necrotic Carapace is pretty good because we're constantly forming corpses with our Reaper minions, as well as I believe it does work with the Blood Mist one. Could be making that one up, but we do form corpses with our Reaper, so we get pretty decent Fortify uptime for just additional damage reduction. However, you could take this out and put it into more movement speed if you prefer. And we have a few points into Gloom, which honestly doesn't matter that much. It just makes our shatter damage a little bit better, which is helpful here and there, but doesn't really matter that much. Then we go into Bone Storm for the additional crit chance and the damage reduction. 3 points into Inspiring Leader to increase the attack speed of our minions, which does mean that they are able to just proc Mendeln, or not proc, but do more Mendeln damage instances more often. And then Death's Defense is pretty much mandatory so that your minions don't just get absolutely raffle stomped all the time. That's very good. And then of course we are using the Shadow Blight passive, which does an okay amount of damage. Honestly, we're not really using it for the damage. We're mainly using it so that we can take advantage of the Shadow Blight legendary. When it comes to the Book of the Dead, we are sacrificing golems for the additional crit damage, and they aren't really all that good at taking advantage of Ring of Mendeln, so we don't really care about them, and we need all the other skill slots. And then we're using Shadow Mages so that they just fire more attacks more often. And then we use the Skeletal Warriors Reapers just so they form additional corpses, and it also seems like they are a little bit more tanky than the Warriors, so that seems to be pretty nice. When it comes to legendaries, you need pretty much every legendary in order for this to work very well. Obviously, you need the Ring of Mendeln, and then the second thing that is very important is getting Grasping Veins on your amulets for the additional crit chance and the crit damage. Anytime that you use your Corpse Tendrils, we're mainly using this for the crit chance so that we can get close to crit cap, and we're taking advantage of a lot of crit damage with the build as well, so we need as much crit chance as we can get. Next to that, the Shadow Blight legendary is unbelievably insane. You can actually codex this, but with a max roll, it gives you 120% increased damage, which we have pretty much up all the time because we're constantly doing damage with Shadow Blight. So this is just a ridiculous amount of damage. After that, we have the Bone Storm and Blood Wave are also darkness skills. This is just to make Bone Storm a darkness skill so that we have permanent uptime on the Shadow Blight legendary itself, and it also does a bit of damage through the shatter damage, but that's not hugely impactful, mainly using it for the Shadow Blight effect. And then we have Bone Storm consumes corpses to increase its duration up to 10 entire seconds. So this is just really good. You honestly could probably swap this off. You would just have a little bit worse uptime on Bone Storm, but when there's high enough density, you have enough lucky hits happening per second that you actually could play without this. But there isn't really anything else that is like particularly insane to use. So this is just nice for overall consistency and just having your Bone Storm up all of the time. But if you're like strapped for, legendary spots or something, this is probably the one that you could play without. And then we have the Explosive Mist on our boots here. You could also go for movement speed here instead, and then go for Blood Mist on the helmet. But this is just so that we get cooldown reduction on our Blood Mist, so we can permanently stay within our Blood Mist, which is very good. But it also makes it so that Blood Mist actually can trigger corpse explosions in the first place, which is mandatory for the build. Then we have Disobedience for just a pretty much permanent 45% increase in armor, which is kind of overkill because we're kind of in Blood Mist all the time, but may as well. And then we have the Gloves of Decay. This honestly isn't really that good. It's just to increase the damage of Shadow Blight. It doesn't have a crazy amount of value on its own. The main value of this is basically sometimes enemies will not be able to die from Mendeln, and you just want to have a little bit of damage with the Shadow Blight damage just to kill some stuff when the minions are kind of trolling you. So it's nice to have, but it isn't like super insane. But honestly, you don't really have anything else that you care to put here. Then we have the increase the amount of Skeletal Mages by 2. And then on the helmet, you could have increased the amount of Skeletal Warriors by 2, or you could go for the survivability in the form of Shielding Storm. If you want more damage, obviously getting the Skeletal Warriors is going to be better for you, so just more instances of Ring of Mendeln damage. But if you want survivability, having the Shielding Storm is nice, which actually recently got fixed, so you pretty much just permanently have a barrier active, which is pretty helpful. But the survivability with the build is already insane, having Blood Mist up permanently, that it's not that big of a deal. When it comes to stats on here, you want armor, cooldown reduction, max HP, intelligence is Still to be determined whether or not it actually works with Ring of Mendeln, because Intelligence scales up skill damage, and Ring of Mendeln is just flat damage, so unsure if Intelligence works there, but feel free to use it, and maybe it gives you extra damage. Haven't tested it myself. The chest, you want to make sure to get maximum minion HP, and outside of that, you just get a whole bunch of damage reduction oriented things. Armor, max HP, DR against shadow damage over time, DR from distant, close, etc. All that stuff is very strong. On the gloves, you want attack speed, crit chance. Lucky hit chance is like okay, it's not really all that mandatory. The only thing you really care about on gloves is crit chance. The attack speed is nice, but the minions only get 30% of it, so they're only getting 5% increased attack speed, which honestly is kind of irrelevant. So just make sure you get the crit chance. Outside of that, lucky hit and int is probably okay. Honestly, just get the crit, like who cares. On the pants, same thing as the chest, like I mentioned, but ranks to Blood Mist is particularly nice just for cooldown reduction on Blood Mist, and then we don't have to put a whole bunch of points there, and then we can get points to more damage and damage reduction. But if you wanted more cooldown reduction on your Blood Mist, you could take some points out and put it into Blood Mist. On the boots, you probably want max evade charges. God, these are a very unfortunate rule. And you just want movement speed and all stats. Damage reduction while injured is pretty good, and movement speed after killing an elite is pretty good. These are cursed. I don't even know why Play-to-Bear rolled dexterity on here, but the movement speed is mainly the mandatory thing for me. On the weapon, you want to have a one-handed wand here for the lucky hit chance. Getting like a sword is okay too, but the crit damage value is very, very low. When it comes to the stats, you want to have vulnerable damage, crit damage, and damage to close. Outside of that, you could get damage to slowed, damage to enemies affected by shadow damage over time, or you could even get intelligence, which could particularly be better if intelligence actually works, but again, I have not tested that, and it is very hard to test things in this game, so it's fine. Damage to slowed is probably better than damage affected by damage over time, though, because it does roll higher. You also get damage to crowd controlled, I believe. For your offhand, you want it to be a focus for the cooldown reduction, so you can get double cooldown reduction on here, and then you can get crit chance, which is very, very high value. Outside of that, lucky hit chance is okay, damage reduction in some capacity is okay. Honestly, is not hugely impactful, but this is probably the god rule here. On your ring, obviously, you can only have one ring because the other one is Ring of Mendeln. So on your ring, you want to at least get maximum minion HP, otherwise they're going to be dying constantly, which is really not fun. And then you want to get critical strike chance and vulnerable damage. The lucky hit chance is pretty optional. Definitely not mandatory because our Bone Prison is guaranteed lucky hit anyways, but you may as well just get something there. You could also get crit damage instead of lucky hit chance if you wanted to opt for more damage, but lucky hit I suppose gives you a little bit more consistency with the build. On the amulet, you want to get movement speed, ranks to the amplified damage passive, which is very good because it's just 12% extra damage all the time. Getting ranks to Macabre skills is okay because it gives you cooldown reduction on your Blood Mist, although it is not mandatory, and then you can get cooldown reduction. Instead of the rank of Macabre skills, you could alternatively get some form of damage reduction if you wanted more survivability, but your survivability is through the roof as it is, and you're literally immune most of the time, so it's kind of overkill, but feel free. Personally, I would just at least get the bottom three that I have here, and then the top one can just be whatever you want. When it comes to the Paragon board here, we pretty much went for as much survivability as humanly possible because a lot of the additive damage, etc. is not really going to work for benefiting Mendeln's damage profile. I'll quickly just go over the Paragon board and what glyphs you actually care for, but the entirety of the Paragon board will be posted in the description, so feel free to just check that out. But in the first board, we are going for Amplify, so we deal extra damage to enemies affected by curse skills, but also we gain a ton of value out of this, putting it in the first board, getting additional damage, as well as getting additional armor. In the second board, we are going for Scent of Death, so we just permanently have increased damage reduction, which is pretty nice. There's also some pretty nice points in here. You could opt out of armor and instead go for damage to healthy here if you wanted a little bit more damage. It's a little overkill, but obviously if you're very early into the build, getting extra damage is quite nice. And damage to healthy pretty much always works because of the way that Barber does its damage. And then we go into the control board, we max out the control glyph for just a ton of damage to enemies that are crowd controlled, which they always are as a result of our corpse tendrils, but also our decrepify around our character. And then we just get a ton of armor and additional damage in the board. And then we go into the bone graft board so that we can grab exploit and max it out. If you're very early into the board, you would rather have the flesh eater board very early on, probably in your first board, because it just gives you 40% additional damage pretty much all the time, and there's also some pretty nice crit damage in here as well. And then we slot in the essence glyph for just additional crit damage, which is very, very strong. And then for our last glyph, we have Dead Razor. This is mainly just for the additional damage reduction, but this board is actually pretty good because we can get damage reduction for our minions, so they stop dying all the time. And I guess this is why we got Dexterity on the boots, so that we could have the additional 20% damage reduction here. So My bad, Play-Doh Bear, for flaming your dexterity boots. Again, the Paragon board will be listed in the description, and I will have a leveling version as well as a level 100 version for those of you guys that are curious how to set it up based on your current level. When it comes to actually playing with the build, it's probably one of the easiest builds in the game to play with. It is a little bit particular in how you actually want to use it. I haven't played with it a ton, but pretty much you can just sit in Blood Mist all the time and just spam your Bone Prison and you should be perfectly fine. There's a little bit of nuance in terms of how to get your minions to actually do the damage, but a lot of the time it's kind of just passive. Sometimes the minions can be trolling and just not helpful. Other times everything will just instantaneously die. You can also just W key through dungeons pretty insanely. I'm just going to leave some of this gameplay here just so you guys can just watch it and kind of see how you want to play with the build, but as long as you can press Bone Prison, press Blood Mist, and press Bloodstorm or Bone Storm whenever it's, off cooldown, you should be perfectly fine. The build kind of plays itself when using the Sacrilegious Heart, as long as you are making sure to just take advantage of Bone Prison and not literally lock yourself in, and you're just making sure to press your buttons when they're on cooldown, or off cooldown rather, you should be perfectly fine. Sometimes when you're fighting suppressor mobs, keep in mind that the Ring of Mendeln can actually bug out, and it is a little bit annoying, which is why Corpse Tendriling them is particularly good, and then trying to get some damage with shadow damage can be helpful. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the build. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you guys did enjoy, and if you have any thoughts about it, please let me know down in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next one.